Good morning, everybody. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I welcome you to the final session, which will continue the discussion on geopolitical tensions and international cooperation, which we started on Wednesday. We will focus in this session then on global value chains. You see the topic here, securing global value chains, geopolitical tensions, and food security. This session will be simultaneously translated, so if you want to listen to that, and Ina already told you, you have to have your headsets with the right channel. And I will accordingly switch depending on what language the speaker will be using. So I will now switch to German first. Okay, nicht erst die jüngsten Krisen, Covid-19 und auch der Ukraine-Krieg, haben uns vor Augen geführt, dass Sicherheit und Nachhaltigkeit von internationalen Wertschöpfungsketten von großer Bedeutung ist. In allen Ebenen wird hier die Diskussion aufgenommen, nicht nur von Seiten der Wissenschaft, auch von Seiten der Politik. Das Ganze hat aber nicht mit diesen letzten beiden sehr bedeutenden Krisen begonnen. Schon vorher hat man sich über die Sicherheit internationaler Wertschöpfungsketten angenommen. Die Daten zeigen, dass im Prinzip seit ungefähr 2008 wir in einer Stagnation der Weltwirtschaft sind. Im Sinne des Außenhandels in Bedeutung zum Bruttoinlandsprodukt sind wir im Prinzip in einer stagnierenden Situation. Der Welthandel nimmt gemessen am Volkseinkommen nicht mehr zu. Ein Grund dafür ist, dass man eben Lieferketten wieder zurückführt, dass man sogenanntes Reshoring macht, dass man Friendshoring macht, all diese Dinge. Die Frage, die sich dabei natürlich stellt, in welchem Ausmaß soll hier eigentlich die Politik, in welchem Ausmaß soll die Wirtschaft selbst Vorkehrungen treffen, um solche Wertschöpfungsketten sicherzustellen, nachhaltiger zu machen. Auch die weiteren Themen wie Klimawandel beispielsweise spielen in diesen Kontext mit rein, aber natürlich auch geopolitische Überlegungen. Das als ganz kurze Einführung zu unserer Panel-Diskussion. Die Organisatoren haben 5 hochrangige Rednerinnen und Redner dazu eingeladen. Ich bin ganz begeistert darüber, dass wir auch ein geschlechtermäßiges, einheitliches Verhältnis erreichen konnten, selbst inklusive meiner Person. Ich selber bin Jens-Peter Löw von der Universität von Kiel. Ich habe die Ehre, heute Sie durch diese Panel-Diskussion zu führen. Wir haben die Rednerinnen und Redner auf der Bühne hier angeordnet, schon in der Reihenfolge ihrer Auftritte. Wir werden jetzt beginnen mit den Eingangsstatements. Ich habe für diese Eingangsstatements ein paar Fragen formuliert, sehen Sie aber aufgrund der Zeitrestriktion den Rednerinnen und Rednern nach, dass sie nicht unbedingt immer alle Aspekte dieser Eingangsfragen aufnehmen können. Nach diesen Eingangsstatements wollen wir dann versuchen, innerhalb des Panels eine Diskussion noch anzustoßen, die eine oder andere Frage noch intensiver zu beleuchten, um dann anschließend das Forum zu öffnen für Ihre Fragen. Also bereiten Sie sich gerne schon vor während der Zeit, immer schreiben Sie sich Ihre Fragen auf. Sie kommen dazu, diese auch stellen zu können. Gut, ich werde die Panelmitglieder einzeln kurz vorstellen und dann sofort um Ihr Eingangsstatement bitten. Ich werde also nicht alle direkt jetzt schon vorstellen, sondern nacheinander vor Ihren Auftritten. Wir beginnen zu meiner Rechten mit Frau Cornelia Berns. Frau Cornelia Berns ist Ministerialdirigentin am BML in der Abteilung Internationaler Handel. Sie war vorher Leiterin der Abteilung Landmärkte und Exportförderung. Sie war auch als Agrarattaché an der Deutschen Botschaft in Peking tätig, hat also umfangreiche internationale Erfahrung in dem Bereich und ich freue mich auf Ihr Eingangsstatement. Ich hatte ihr dazu 2 Fragen geschickt. Im Wesentlichen, welche Rolle spielen geopolitische Spannungen im Prinzip für die Funktionsfähigkeit von internationalen Wertschöpfungsketten und welche Rolle soll hier eigentlich der Staat oder spezieller noch auch Ihr Haus, das Ministerium für Landwirtschaft in Deutschland, dabei spielen, um diese Funktionsfähigkeit zu unterstützen? Frau Berns, ich freue mich, dass Sie mit uns sein können und bin gespannt auf Ihre Ausführungen.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank. Zunächst mal, ich leite die Unterabteilung für internationale Zusammenarbeit und Welternährung. Das geht ein bisschen über Handel hinaus. Mein Dank gilt an den Veranstaltern des IAMO Forums. Ich freue mich sehr, hier zu sein und darf Ihnen die Grüße von Bundesminister Özdemir ausrichten, der Ihrer Veranstaltung sehr viel Erfolg wünscht. Das IAMO leistet herausragende Forschungsarbeit mit dem Blick auf die Transformation der Agrar- und Ernährungssektoren in den Ländern Mittel- und Osteuropas sowie Zentralasien und China. Diese Regionen umfassen eine Vielzahl von Ländern mit einem entscheidenden Einfluss auf Agrarmärkte und Strukturen. Diese regionale Schwerpunktsetzung bei der Forschungstätigkeit des IAMO ist ein Alleinstellungsmerkmal des Instituts. Und dass heute Vertreter aus zahlreichen Regionen hier sind, zeigt den Stellenwert des IAMO auch für die Vernetzung der Wissenschaft. Der russische Angriffskrieg auf die Ukraine, den die Bundesregierung scharf verurteilt, hat erhebliche Auswirkungen auf die Agrarmärkte, die Welternährung und die fortschreitende EU-Integration der Länder Mittel- und Osteuropas. Das IAMO kann mit dem Fokus seiner Forschungen auf diese Regionen einen wichtigen Beitrag zur Folgenabschätzung leisten. Und diese Erkenntnisse sind auch für das Bundesministerium für Ernährung und Landwirtschaft von hoher Bedeutung. Ich komme gerade zurück von den G20-Agrarministertreffen in Hyderabad, die sich auch mit den globalen Fragen beschäftigt haben. Und die Folgen des russischen Angriffskriegs verstärken die durch die Klimakrise und die Covid-Pandemie bereits stark gefährdete Welternährungslage. Leider überschattet diese geopolitische Situation auch die multilaterale Zusammenarbeit. Trotzdem sind sich nahezu alle G20-Länder einig, dass die globale Zusammenarbeit wichtig ist, um die derzeitigen mehrfachen Krisen gemeinsam und gleichzeitig zu meistern. Die Klimakrise, die Biodiversitätskrise, Zoonosen, Kriege und Konflikte und last but not least die Ernährungskrise. Die nationale und globale Ernährungssicherung muss gestärkt werden. Dafür sind nachhaltige und resiliente Wertschöpfungsketten, regelbasierte Handelsbeziehungen sowie die Transformation der Ernährungssysteme notwendig. Die Basis muss eine klimasmarte und biodiversitätserhaltende Landwirtschaft und inklusive Agrarwertschöpfungsketten und ich denke auch die Chancen der Digitalisierung sein. Die Transformation hin zu nachhaltigen Agrar- und Ernährungssystemen ist auch der Schwerpunkt der Innen- und Außenpolitik des BMEL. Der Ökolandbau ist dabei unser Leitbild. Und die Umsetzung des Menschenrechts auf angemessene Nahrung ist gemeinsame Aufgabe national, regional und global. Zu Ihren Fragen. Die geopolitischen Konflikte beeinflussen die Funktionsfähigkeit von globalen Wertschöpfungsketten erheblich. Die Folgen des russischen Angriffs auf die Ukraine haben das gezeigt. Starke Abhängigkeiten von einzelnen Märkten oder Rohstoffquellen können im Krisenfall Ernährungskrisen verschärfen. Sie verursachen erhebliche wirtschaftliche Schäden und führen zu politischen Abhängigkeiten. Abschottung ist jedoch keine Alternative. Extremwetterereignisse und zunehmende Trockenheit im Zusammenhang mit der Klimakrise bedrohen die Ernährung in vielen Ländern akut. Wir brauchen daher neben einer gestärkten Eigenversorgung funktionierende Wertschöpfungsketten und einen offenen internationalen Agrarhandel. Abschottung verstärkt die Volatilität auf den Agrarmärkten und verschärft oft die Not der Ärmsten. Die G7-Agrarminister haben deshalb bereits unter deutscher Präsidentschaft unterstrichen, dass gerade in der Krise offene Märkte Not tun. Ein geschlossenes Vorgehen unserer Wertepartner und der EU gegenüber Drittstaaten ist zudem essentiell. Gerade in Krisen ist es notwendig, alle Stakeholder in die Entscheidungsfindung einzubeziehen. Nur so können Problemlagen schnell erkannt und im Austausch mit allen Beteiligten gezielt Lösungen erarbeitet werden. Zudem unterstützt BMEL Unternehmen bei der Erschließung neuer und der Pflege bestehender Märkte mit speziellen Förderprogrammen. Das Exportförder- und das Auslandsmesseprogramm möchte ich erwähnen. In Kooperation mit unseren Partnern arbeiten wir zudem am Abbau ungerechtfertigter, nicht-tarifärer Handelshemmnisse. Eine funktionierende WTO und ein breites Spektrum von Freihandelsabkommen schützen vor einseitigen Abhängigkeiten und sichern den Zugang zu Waren und Rohstoffen genauso wie zu Absatzmärkten. Die Strategie der Bundesregierung, das Eckpunktepapier zur Handelspolitik 2022 für einen freien und fairen Welthandel, sieht die Diversifizierung des deutschen und des EU-Außenhandels vor. Globale Wertschöpfungsketten mit vielen Partnern sind weniger anfällig für Krisen. Vor allem mit Ländern, mit denen wir grundlegende Werte teilen, wollen wir Kooperation und Handel intensivieren. Gemeinsame Nachhaltigkeitsstandards sind Grundlage für die Intensivierung von Handelsbeziehungen. Die Politik der EU muss aktiv mit unseren Handelspartnern diskutiert und die Beweggründe für unsere Entscheidungen transparent gemacht werden. Das gilt insbesondere für die Maßnahmen im Zusammenhang mit der Farm-to-Fork-Strategy und die steigenden Anforderungen der EU für Sorgfaltspflichten in den Lieferketten. Agrarmärkte sollten auch transparent sein. So können Versorgungsengpässe und auch Preisentwicklungen und Auswirkungen entlang der gesamten Kette besser abgeschätzt werden. Das BMEL unterstützt daher AMIS, das Marktinformationssystem der G20, das Informationen zu den wichtigsten Agrarmärkten zusammenführt und auswertet. Vielen Dank, so viel für den Anfang.
Vielen Dank, Frau Berns. Ich komme dann direkt zu meiner Rechten, zu Per Brodersen. Per Brodersen ist Direktor der German Agribusiness Alliance an der deutschen Eastern Business Association in Berlin. Er hält einen Doktortitel in osteuropäischer Geschichte. Und er hat in verschiedensten internationalen Organisationen gearbeitet, darunter die Humboldt Foundation, die Max-Planck-Gesellschaft in München und Berlin und hat als Berater gearbeitet für das Aufsichtsgremium am Deutschen Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung, bevor er der German Agribusiness Alliance vorgestanden ist. Herr Brodersen, ich bitte um Ihr Statement. Ich hatte Ihnen auch dazu ein paar Fragen geschickt. Moment. Und da ging es im Wesentlichen darum, welche Rolle beispielsweise das EU-Lieferkettengesetz oder die Richtlinien zum Lieferkettengesetz spielen zur Sicherstellung von globalen Wertschöpfungsketten und wie diesbezüglich die Perspektive von Wirtschaftsunternehmen insbesondere ist. Vielen Dank.
Ja, Herr Professor Loy. Vielen Dank für die Möglichkeit, heute hier auf dem Panel mit dabei zu sein und Fragen der nachhaltigen Lieferkettengestaltung gemeinsam zu diskutieren. In der Tat vertrete ich heute die Privatwirtschaft hier in diesem Kreise. Die German Agribusiness Alliance ist ein Zusammenschluss der 40 führenden Unternehmen des deutschen Agribusiness. In unseren Reihen finden sich große DAX-Unternehmen, aber auch Hidden Champions und der deutsche Mittelstand. Und wir sind aktiv in den Regionalschwerpunkten Osteuropa und Zentralasien sowie Asien, vor allen Dingen mit China und Indien, sowie in einigen afrikanischen Ländern. In der Tat, Sie hatten mir mit auf den Weg gegeben die Frage danach, inwiefern der CSDDD, die Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive der Europäischen Union, dazu beitragen kann, globale Wertschöpfungsketten resilienter zu machen. Ich möchte nicht direkt die zahlreiche Stimmen wiederholen, es würde sich dabei um ein bürokratisches Monstrum handeln. Die German Agribusiness Alliance hat aktiv in Zusammenarbeit mit anderen Unternehmen die Initiative der G7-Staaten beispielsweise unterstützt. Der World Benchmark Alliance, der Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, der WBA SSCI, wonach es darum geht, genau diese Fragen einmal ganz konkret auch für Unternehmen, die grenzüberschreitend aktiv sind, handhabbar zu machen. Sicherlich ist ganz wichtig, mit Blick auf die CSDDD zu diskutieren, dass für Kunden und Verbraucher in zunehmendem Maße Verlässlichkeit und Nachverfolgbarkeit einen immer größeren Stellenwert einnimmt und dass auch in Zeiten der jetzt intensiv gesteigerten internationalen Arbeitsteilung natürlich auch Verlässlichkeit für beide Seiten, sprich für Produzenten als auch Konsumenten, eine immer größer werdende Rolle spielt. Wir hatten ja vor einigen Jahren, sprich vor der Pandemie, einmal Gelegenheit im Rahmen des GFFA auch einmal die Rolle von Standards zu diskutieren. Ich sehe gerade mit Blick auf die CSDDD auch die Möglichkeit oder das Potenzial, einen Trickle-Down-Effekt wirklich zu sehen. Inwiefern bestimmte Standards sich sozusagen weiter entlang der Kette, jeweils in Richtung Beginn der Kette, weiterentwickeln können, Spillover, Trickle-Down, sodass es sozusagen auch eine Weiterentwicklung von Produktionsmöglichkeiten tatsächlich gibt. Nichtsdestotrotz sehen wir natürlich auch als Privatwirtschaft den einen oder anderen negativen Punkt dieses Vorhabens seitens der EU. In Deutschland haben wir seit längerem die Diskussion darüber, inwiefern der Verbraucher tatsächlich willens ist, beispielsweise Stichwort Thema Tierwohl, mehr für eine nachhaltige Produktion von Lebensmitteln tatsächlich zu bezahlen. Und wir alle kennen die Schere zwischen den Antworten in den Umfragen, wonach dies ein wichtiges, ein zentrales Anliegen vieler Verbraucher ist, und dann aber letztendlich eine andere Entscheidung jeweils an der Supermarktkasse gefällt wird. Wichtig ist für uns als Privatwirtschaft eben auch der Punkt, inwiefern eine solche Regelung nicht die Flexibilität bei der Auswahl von Zulieferern einschränken kann. Wir haben in den letzten 3, 4, 5 Jahren mehrere Momente der totalen Disruption erlebt, was Lieferketten anbelangt. Dazu muss ich nicht die Pandemie zählen, dazu muss ich nicht Russlands Krieg gegen die Ukraine zählen. Was uns fehlt bislang wäre sozusagen eine Art Force-Majeure-Mechanismus, der ermöglicht, dass man in ganz bestimmten Zeiten unter bestimmten Voraussetzungen mit erleichterten Bedingungen, was Accountability in diesem Zusammenhang anbelangt, erreichen kann. Also wir sehen weiterhin ein Spannungsverhältnis zwischen Nachverfolgbarkeit und der Flexibilisierung von Lieferketten in diesem Zusammenhang. Auf keinen Fall, und da schaue ich ein bisschen in Ihre Richtung, Frau Berns, kann eine solche Regelung natürlich den beständigen Dialog mit internationalen Partnern, darunter vor allen Dingen Regierungen, ersetzen. Und dafür steht eben auch weiterhin die Privatwirtschaft natürlich bereit, gemeinsam mit der Politik diesen Dialog weiterzuführen und nach Möglichkeit zu intensivieren. Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank, Herr Brodersen. I will now switch back to English and welcome on my left Ethel Solingen from the University of California, Irvine. Ethel Solingen is a distinguished professor and Tierney Chair in Peace and Conflict at the University of California, Irvine. She was president of the International Studies Association, Susan Strange Professor at the London School of Economics, Richard Holbrooke Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, and president of the ICA's International Political Economy section. She received the William and Catherine East Award from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Best Book Award, a MacArthur Foundation Peace and International Cooperation Award, and a Distinguished Scholar Award in International Security. Ethel, I once again welcome you, and I will also address a few questions to you. And the ones were, how good are we in predicting political and or economic crisis to make global value chains more resilient? And if we cannot predict crisis, how do we prepare for them? How does the US government act on making global value chains more resilient? And is that even a topic in the US? And finally, and maybe you put this later, is the US even a driver of geopolitical tensions right now? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this really magnificent conference. I've learned a lot from all of you. And I especially want to thank the phenomenal effort of our Ukrainian colleagues with their country and families under savage attack by Russia. They were able to share their important research with us, and I'm grateful for that. So given the time limit, 6 minutes, and multiple questions, I have an outline. Let's see. I'm not going to go through all of those, but let me try very briefly to answer the first question: how good are we at predicting crises? Not very good, and you all know how good economics is at predicting recessions and other economic crises, and my field is no different. Not a good track record. In July of 1914, few heeded the warnings of the offensive that pushed the world into World War I. Likewise, very few heeded the warnings in 1939. And in 2022, most failed to predict Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, despite the 2014 precedent. The director of US National Intelligence, Avril Haines, the first female director of DNI, by the way, openly warned of an imminent invasion by Russia, but few were listening. But all of that is to answer the question that we seem to be unable to learn from the past to improve our predictions. Your other question was, how can we prevent the abyss? Well, by learning from the legacy of war, destruction, and death imprinted on the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, by dictatorships and so on, and I believe truly democracy and peace hang on the balance. This is very much related to GVCs. I may get to that later or not, depending on the time. But specific to GVCs, there's some efforts to identify choke points, research on choke points and enhance GVC resilience, some of it actually at the WTO. This is also what we've tried to do. Let's see if I forgot to move. So I'm building on this work. This is what we've tried to do, along with two Chinese colleagues, in this contribution to the 2021 GVC report addressing geopolitical, environmental, and pandemic sources of risks to GVC. Unfortunately, there's no time to discuss right now, but many of the comments, especially by Cornelia, right, the points were very similar, so maybe we can get back to that. But another question I got was, what's driving geopolitical tensions? There is a pattern that we know very well in my field of action-reaction that cannot really lead to a very good place for anybody. According to economist Richard Baldwin in Geneva, the former, and also the former Australian Premier Kevin Rudd and others, the trend towards shortening GVCs and self-reliance has actually been in full swing since 2004 in some countries. And so that engendered a tit for tat for well over a decade now. It's not just a matter of the last 6 years, but of course things have derailed. But even food import refusals increased since 2013 and so on, according to another paper by Perlman et al. Subsequently, though, trade and technology wars, especially among major powers, compounded the risks, exactly as was said before, and climate change, of course, as well, casting a shadow on this emerging GVC infrastructure. But it was Russia's invasion of a fellow UN member country that is considered, and I'm now quoting economists on this, the major driver of tensions since 2022. There's a paper, for instance, by Yale economist Penelope Goldberg that defines the invasion as the catalyst for a new phase in deglobalization or globalization. We can quarrel with that because I'm not persuaded we're in a completely deglobalizing framework, but that's a subsidiary question. But Russia has also introduced the most destabilizing nuclear threats since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and naturally, governments, states, and firms have reacted to these risks. Regarding how states reacted, I do believe the Biden administration has done so with exemplary caution. I can come back to this question if anybody is interested. Regarding firms, which is a little bit more of a focus here, if I can get it right, it won't move. It's a little stuck, but regarding firms, there is some heterogeneity there in their response to this renewed, oh no, I went way beyond. Let me see. Well, okay, we can do this. I shorten it, so why is it not moving? Okay, can you move one? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, regarding firms, as I said, there is some heterogeneity in their responses, but most is my view from data, survey data I've been reviewing. Most are pricing risk at a much higher level over the last year, according to all these published industry surveys by the American Chamber of Commerce, the EU Chamber of Commerce, Japan's JETRO, South Korea, etc. And this change is a product of private firms' own calculation of risk. According to the WTO, the proportion of surveyed firms who reported purchasing political risk insurance nearly trebled from 25% in 2019 to 68% in 2023. The proportion predicting the decoupling, that decoupling would grow was 12% in early 2022, rising to 42% in 2023. But the US Treasury Secretary has consistently advised, to your question, that decoupling is not in anybody's interest. Most recently at hearings on Capitol Hill just a few days ago, on the 13th of June. However, firms' uncertainty has peaked since 2022, bringing the risk of GVCs and FDI fragmentation is happening. It wasn't mentioned so much, but and it's bringing those levels to critical, according to a study actually by Georgieva at the IMF et al., the 2023 IMF World Economic Outlook. And so states may think they can modulate the risk, but when hyper-nationalism, mercantilism, and aggression raise their heads, it's extremely hard to get the genie back into the bottle. And so whatever we think as academics, perceptions of risk have a life of their own, and firms, business firms, have the pulse on risks. Now, the cost of fragmentation, maybe I can get there. The cost of fragmentation would be very high. And there's a recent WTO study that predicts severe declines in real GDP with both partial and more extreme fragmentation, with least developed countries and developing countries most affected. Most OECD countries, by the way, will be least affected. But the opportunity costs of foregoing re-globalization are estimated at about 8.7% of real GDP at the global level. So risks remain. There's a study by Majun and Stolzenberg at the WTO that estimates that 19% of global exports, this is global, not just food, are in bottleneck products that have few suppliers but a large market share. So what can be done, especially related to food security? Many of the things actually were preempted here by Cornelia and so on. diversification of sources and markets away from concentration is very solid advice for all GVCs. Food security, by the way, is not equivalent to self-sufficiency. Security and resilience are enhanced by trade diversification. Aspirations, from where I come from in disciplinary terms, aspirations of self-sufficiency historically became chimeras, very self-defeating, and induce mistrust from targets, but also from third parties. Second point, very briefly, domestic production of food should never be a priority when it contributes to climate change, to the worsening of climate change. And I say this as a Californian, okay? We in California cannot sacrifice the environment when soil conditions are inappropriate and competitiveness does not exist. Okay, if this applies to us, but it also applies worldwide. Third, trust is also enhanced by transparency. There was already a comments on how important transparency is. Our study that I cited before, which is sponsored by WTO, OECD, and other economic institutes, Asian Development Bank, the conclusions are very, very much impressing the point on transparency, especially transparency vis-a-vis international institutions. We have a deficit of transparency in every field, from agriculture to health and beyond, and we've made that point in the 2021 GVC report, but unfortunately, lack of transparency has only increased, in my view, since. And finally, I'm going to end here because I think I'm approaching my time. Food should never, never, ever be subject to coercive statecraft by anybody for any reason.
Thank you very much, Ito. We're turning over again to my left to Sergei Zorya. Sergei is a lead agriculture economist of the World Bank based in Vienna, Austria. In his current position, he leads agriculture policy and investment dialogue in Ukraine and Uzbekistan. Sergei joined the World Bank in 2005 as a young professional and since then worked in Africa, East Asia and Pacific, and Europe and Central Asia regions. He also worked in the Global Engagement Unit of the Agriculture and Food Global Practice. Sergei holds a PhD, a master's degree, and in agriculture economics from the University of Zhytomyr. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. In the Ukraine, and a PhD in agriculture economics from the Georg August University of Göttingen, Germany. Sergei, welcome. And I also placed a few questions with you because you are with the World Bank. You are, to some extent, representing the World Bank here. And my question would be, is freer trade and thereby freer trade in global value chains still the World Bank's answer to ensure welfare, food security, etc., and manage situations of crisis? And how does the World Bank see initiatives right now to more regionalize, to reshoring, to friendshoring initiatives, to restrict trade? And maybe you can give us some perspective from Central Asia as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens-Peter. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's my first alma mater in Germany is Göttingen, but second is definitely IAMO Halle. Always happy to be here. Couple of weeks ago, I was the peer reviewer of the concept note for the report in the World Bank, which is called Trade, Food Security in the Era of Geopolitical Tensions and Climate Change. Since your forum, you were preparing forum before that report copy, so my colleagues probably copy-pasted your idea that we need to study too. But what I want to say that in 1 year, you will have official stamped position of the cohort of people in the World Bank who think or changes of the trade, what the role of the trade will play in the food security in the new era of which is different from what we had a couple of decades ago. My observations working in different parts of the bank and different parts of the world are the following. The free trade is still the core element of our advice to the countries, because in practice, in most countries, there is a rare substitution to the power of trade to achieve the same development objectives. Trade did magic for poverty reduction globally, and for most of the countries in the world, there is no substitute. Could be a lot of talks, there could be a decline in trade, but most of the countries will never be able to go into the autarky. In spite of the fact the trade is under attack, the last 2.5 days is the indication of many examples from all over the world of how free trade become not really free, and a lot of defined by geopolitical tensions, and many countries suffer. There was example, again, the IMF divide this world into 1970-2007, when we say globalization era, and Jens Peter talked at that time, global trade growth every year was about 6%, 5.8. And the global GDP growth was 3.3. And sort of the trade was driving growth during that period of time. Now, from 2007 to now, trade growth was about 3% and global GDP was about 2%. And so Martin Wolf from Financial Times called this era not deglobalization, he called it slowbalization. So maybe we can also introduce one of these elements. When we look on the free trade, and right now the world in the multiple food crisis mode, right? After COVID, we have the war on Ukraine, and you have the continued spike even before the COVID started. And so we always put the free trade as, when we advise our clients, countries what to do, and we finance certain investments, we always say free trade. That's number one. Second, you can do what needs to be done better, targeted support to the vulnerable consumers. It can be time-bound support to the producers to accelerate supply response. But in those short-term responses, we do our best. Sometimes we fail, but we do our best to really not to forget about the long term, because this is your climate change. Because the climate change is not a short-term event any longer. Geopolitics, yes, but climate change is the new normal. And that's sort of the long term, that's what needs to come in place very often. And we, again, in our interventions, in the emergency projects of the World Bank, we still try to spend like 20-30% of our funds for the long-term development, which is often very difficult. Much easier to do this with the grants. We just insist, it's free money, you don't have to repay, we can insist. But if our country borrows from the World Bank, they have priorities, people dying right now, right? So why to think about the long-term development? But it's very important for us, because we see that will not, that the short-term interventions now will not be able to solve a lot of problems. I think what has changed for many countries around the world is the following. The first is this global volatility, uncertainty, permanent or temporary? Because if it's temporary, then you can really use for a couple of years a scaled up safety net. Let's say not many developing countries have safety nets, but many develop those safety nets. And you can scale up support as a reaction to mitigate the impact of the higher food prices. But if it's permanent, let's say for the next 20 years, then it's not affordable fiscally. Africa is in the public debt crisis, so they cannot afford to do many of these things. So the first research question for all of you who will do a lot of research is permanent versus temporary, because that's a lot of things coming into our decision making what to do. Second is, when we were advocating to any country why they need to use the free trade and less self-sufficiency in the past, we are saying, look, the global volatility and the world market prices usually much smaller than in your local market, right? So by importing, you import lower volatility. By exporting, you connect into lower volatility. Now we're coming into the era where the global market volatility often higher than the local market volatility. So the argument to use in trade to reduce local volatility in this era goes away. Again, it is temporary, it is permanent, the question. So when we think about global, again, a lot of differences. Are you net exporter, you are net importer, right? And then if you are net importer, do you have the access to sea or you don't have the access to sea? Because that changes, that gives you alternative of options. For the net exporters, we were consistently against the export bans. Why we understand sometimes that it's in the interest of their specific country, but it's the short-term gains. And the World Bank has been very clear and vocal on not using export bans as the means to solve its own food security problems, because it's exaggerate their own food security problems. The biggest shift in our dialogue and what we see happening in the countries, and I'm coming back, maybe coming to Central Asia now, because that is the example where geography of that place does not allow to think about diversification in the sense we think about diversification. We all talk about diversify, but Uzbekistan is double landlocked country. And when I was based in Tashkent for 3 years, my first exam in my second day was, what's double landlocked country? It's when you're surrounded by the landlocked countries. So it's double landlocked country. So, and all of the countries around also not very well connected because of geography. And they are trading partners, Russia, China, Afghanistan, and Iran. And most of these countries use trade for political benefits. So there are a lot of challenges there. And diversification, they are much more complicated than if you have the access to the sea and you can sort of talk about it. Most of them are net importers. And they say for food security, for grains, for oilseeds, they depend a lot on Kazakhstan. That's the only net exporter there. And what we observe in the last 5 years or so, increased use of the instruments changes the import tariffs. So the variable import tariffs, exemption from the taxes, early warning system, and public stocks. And I want to stop a little bit on the strategic public stocks, because as we say 10 years ago, somebody told us to the World Bank, help us to sort of work on the public stocks. So we say, no. Because the public stocks, we know many examples of what you get guaranteed, you get cost. You get corruption associated cost, and you had sometimes, very often, distortion of the market. So if the stocks are large enough, they distort the market. The benefits need to be earned hard, and it's not guaranteed, right? So we offer like, no public stocks. But now, I would say in that environment, when global volatility is higher than it used to be, and is gonna stay with us for the next decade at least, public stocks in many net importing countries is a solution which gonna save trade. Because the IFPRI did study the probabilities. If your food inflation increased by 5 percentage points, the probability of the export ban increased by 40%, right? And so you need to give alternatives to these countries. You cannot just say, don't use export ban or don't use this, but what to use. The country's consumers spend 40-50% of their expenditures on food. So it's very sensitive, politicized. And so the instruments like public stocks, the variable import tariff within the bounds of the WTO, but within that range, is early warning system started to play a very, very important role. So we are, but also just the feedback on my sort of takeaway from the Central Asia, in spite of the many measures this government take in the short-term production, simple credit lines, etc., they will still be dependent on trade. Trade will not go away. But we are entering into the era where we need to be more proactive in using the instruments which maybe we were abandoning in the past to save the trade, because without them, the countries will be much more resistant and thinking more about self-sufficiency than was the case before. Thank you.
Sergey, thank you very much. And last and surely but not least, we have Dr. Lena Kuhn with us. She received a PhD from Halle University, and she is a senior research at the IAMO with a research focus on sustainable rural development and agriculture transformation. Specifically, she works on climate risk management and innovation adoption for dealing with global challenges like resource scarcity and climate change in China and Central Asia. Since 2021, she is coordinating the research project DTAC on digitalization of China's agriculture, and further, she is one of the coordinators of IAMO's China Research Group. So he will hopefully also enlighten us a little bit about China's role in all of this, which is right now maybe not on a top priority, but it's still in the backyard a very important country. So my question to you was a little different. Global value chains shall be sustainable, efficient, resilient, etc. What is the role of digitalization in this process of securing global value chains? And maybe, if you like, you can enlarge a little bit, talking about the role of China in this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction and the opportunity to participate in this conversation. Actually, it's an advantage to be last. Now I have opportunity to build a bit on previous comments and speaking points. So we have talked a lot about importance of open trade. My previous speaker talked about, let's say, the importance of public stocks maybe. But I would like to come back to another, let's say, important point. I would say is a combination of all these three. I mean, food security means, yes, open trade. It means, for some countries, maybe stocks, I don't know. But I think we should come back to the question also that large consumers like China, like India, need to have like a competitive, resilient and sustainable farming production, domestic production too. Also for like maybe perceived food security. And in our work, yes, coming to your question, we're talking about digitalization, which has been considered as a potential solution. In some cases, there's a huge technology mix. I don't want to bore you, but a lot of these components, yes, do have the theoretical potential to increase food security. I say theoretical because I would like to split up the question. So in theory, does digitalization contribute to, let's say, sustainable, resilient and global value chains? I think yes. We have, for instance, potential improvements in terms of productivity of yields. I think another FAO study found like 10 to 20% increase in yields for specific crops. We have the opportunity to increase resilience, certainly also against climate change, like early warning systems. A lot of the potential of digitalization is about higher efficiency of resource inputs like water, fertilizer, pesticides, all that. A lot about digitalization is also about a resource which will come more scarce in the future, labor. So it's all about, a lot is about labor saving too. So in Germany we have the problem of finding qualified labor. But for instance, as we heard in China, that will also be a big issue, finding farmers anymore. Second part of the question, is it possible in practical terms to realize some contribution to food security? And for that, yeah, someone has to switch apparently, it's not. Okay, please switch, okay, yeah. So theoretically we covered that. Can you switch to the next one? The practical question is, of course, yes, technology is out there, but well, how far is it being used? So that's, I think, a very recent study from Bitkom from 22, I'm sorry. So in Germany, for instance, we do find a lot of adoption of these technologies. Let's say in some cases up to 2/3 of the farmers, of the surveyed farmers, are using certain technologies, and even more are planning to do so. But as we learned, let's say we need a competitive, sustainable and resilient production, especially also in those countries that are maybe not comparable to Germany, like not these high-income countries, not big farming systems. And in our project, we recently did a survey among Chinese farmers. Let's say, next one. Where we looked at in smaller farming systems like China, and unfortunately what we can say is, so digitalization is the orange bar, and I have to highlight that because you can barely see it. So digitalization levels, when we talk about ownership of these machineries, farm machineries, is extremely low, so around 1–2%. In total, maybe 4.5% of our surveyed farmers, in this case 2,100 crop farmers, did own any of these technologies. If you add on top rented or borrowed machinery, we get to a level of about 9%. But you can see how low that really is. The numbers get a bit better in animal husbandry. So the levels here are getting higher. But maybe when we talk about labor-intensive systems, for instance, cattle, like still have very low values here. Why is that? We said large-scale farming. That's not exactly the case for China. So as most of you will know, if you have extremely small farm sizes and plot sizes, we found the highest digitalization levels, of course, for larger farms, larger than 10 hectare, but really not a lot going on in these smaller farms. Why is that? I think is quite clear: economies of scale, but also know-how of the farmers, education levels among the farmers, and capital. Yeah, so you need resources to implement that. Now the big question is, does it mean we have to change the farming system, to change, let's say, to consolidate the land before we can start digitizing? Next one. Yeah, not necessarily. Yeah? So I think technical solutions are out there. Maybe they wouldn't be like really imminent to our perceptions, and maybe also our companies don't really produce that. But there's like compact mini tractors, for instance, produced in China and India. So mechanization is also possible for small plots. The next one, please. We can also, let's say, why not also for digital technology? For instance, this is like a Chinese developed electric driverless compact tractor, which would solve all these issues at once. Of course, the cost problem still remains, but let's say we could try to introduce, let's say, more modular solutions, simpler, low-cost solutions. But also we could maybe move on to expand our ideas in the sense that we find, sorry, next one. So think about solutions like services, yeah? So you don't need to buy these technologies. You can also rely on services. That also reduces our know-how problem in the sense that you don't have to implement all this on your own. But still know-how remains. Yeah? We in China, we're talking about farmers that have very low education levels, for instance. I'm pretty sure in India we have similar issues. We educated people, they move out of the countryside. They don't want to stay behind. We will have to solve these issues at some point, also when we talk about using of apps. No one is really taking this out of your hands. So agriculture, education in general, keeping people in the countrysides. Even if you manage to consolidate land, education issues will remain. And that was the end of my point.
Lena, thank you very much. And from now on, feel free if you want to put in a comment, if you want to put in a question. We start maybe with a few questions with the panel, and then I think there will be many questions from the audience, so I will probably switch a little bit earlier to get questions from you. But let's maybe stick a little bit to one point that I would be interested in and that I don't see discussed very much. So our topic is also food security, and Sergey, for instance, and Edel, for instance, gave a few points on that. However, I don't see the discussion of the conflicts of interests here. So on the one hand, we have like sustainable global value chains. On the one hand, we want to do something for the environment. So the initiatives at the EU level, for instance, the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork initiative, I mean, they make relatively clear what we would like to do to ensure the environment, to have biodiversity, etc. However, there is a big conflict with global goals of food security in this case. And the same direction is if we do some friendshoring or reshoring and cutting global value chains, we're making things less effective. So we probably have less food available if we want to follow all those issues. I mean, if the EU takes up and says, okay, we want to have 30% organic farming in the EU up to 2030, which I doubt they will achieve, but if they would, this would have a massive impact on production here. So can we really, is this, I mean, sometimes I get the impression that in particular politicians seem to give us the idea this is one goal. So we are achieving food security by making the environment more friendly, by making global value chains more reliable. I'm just provoking here a little bit and like your statements on that, and maybe we can start with you, Ms. Burns. And from now on, you choose your language, please. If you want to speak English, you can use English. If you want to use German, you use German. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank. Vielen Dank auch für die Steilvorlage mit Ihrer Frage. Ich denke, wir konzentrieren uns hier sehr darauf auf die Frage, ob Europa die Welt ernähren sollte und ob wir das nicht mehr können, wenn wir uns auch um die Ziele Klimaschutz und Biodiversitätserhaltung kümmern. Wir müssen sehen, dass wir eine sehr intensive Produktion in Europa haben und dass diese Produktion auch für die Umwelt nicht ohne Folgen bleibt. Wir sehen aber auch andere Weltregionen, wo die Produktion noch sehr, sehr extensiv ist, wo es viele Flächen gibt, die eigentlich landwirtschaftliche Flächen sind, aber gar nicht bewirtschaftet werden. Der Sachverständigenbeirat Globale Umweltfragen hat ausgerechnet, dass in vielen afrikanischen Regionen nur 12 Kilogramm Stickstoff pro Hektar eingesetzt werden. Ich denke, hier kann man ohne weiteres auch die Nährstoffversorgung deutlich verbessern, ohne gleich massive Umweltschäden zu verursachen, wie sie bei uns der Fall sind. Außerdem verlieren wir fast die Hälfte der globalen Ernte durch Schädlinge oder weil sie gar nicht geerntet werden, weil sie beim Transport oder bei der Lagerung verloren gehen und auch bei uns in den Haushalten einfach auch weggeschmissen und nicht gegessen werden. Ich denke auch, die Frage, was mit Lebensmittelverlusten passiert, wird auch einen großen Beitrag dazu leisten, die Welternährung zu sichern. Die Frage der Menge, die für Tierfutter verwendet wird bei den Flächen, die wir weltweit haben, ist dabei noch gar nicht gestellt, aber auch die, denke ich, muss man zumindest in den Industrieländern sich stellen. Vielen Dank.
Vielleicht nur ganz kurz eine Nachfrage dazu. Ich stimme Ihnen völlig zu, alle Dinge, die Sie aufgezählt haben, sind sehr richtig, aber natürlich zum großen Teil außerhalb Ihres Einflusses. Wenn wir beispielsweise die Verbraucher in Deutschland nehmen, ist völlig richtig, da wird eine Menge weggeworfen. Die Frage ist, wie wollen Sie das wirklich ändern? Es gibt ja Kampagnen, die dazu aufrufen. In der Kindererziehung wird es ein bisschen umgesetzt, aber ansonsten haben sie ja wenig Eingriffsmöglichkeiten und die Politik macht auch nicht den Eindruck, als wenn sie da versuchen wollte, staatlich wirklich zu intervenieren, zumindest auf der Ebene des Endverbraucherhaushalts. Zweitens sprachen Sie an, der Einsatz von Düngemitteln international. Ist das BML hier aktiv, dass man sagt, wir stellen Düngemittel zur Verfügung zum Einsatz beispielsweise in afrikanischen Ländern oder wir machen in wirklich umfangreicherer Weise dort Dinge, um die Wertschöpfungsketten effizienter zu gestalten? Also haben wir diese Eingriffsmöglichkeiten, dass es da wirklich zu einer Bewegung kommt?
Ja, vielen Dank für Ihre Nachfragen. Zum einen denke ich, wir werden sicher nicht hingehen, die Verbraucher zwingen, bestimmte Dinge zu machen. Wir sind ein freies Land und was jemand zu Hause macht, ist immer noch die Entscheidung des Einzelnen. Aber wir sollten den Verbrauchern die Informationen zur Verfügung stellen, die sie brauchen, um ihr eigenes Handeln zu reflektieren, auch Tipps geben, was man mit Abfällen macht. Wir haben dazu eine große Kampagne. Ich denke aber, der Schwerpunkt muss sein, auch in Ländern, in denen viele Lebensmittel verloren gehen, auf dem Weg vom Betrieb zum Verbraucher, dass wir hier Unterstützung leisten. Die Kollegen vom BMZ haben umfangreiche Programme, wo sie Länder dabei unterstützen. Auch wir arbeiten allerdings nur punktuell mit Ländern zusammen, um hier Lieferketten zu verbessern und die Frage der Lagerung und Weiterverarbeitung von Lebensmitteln in den Vordergrund zu rücken. Zur Düngemittelfrage, ich denke, ein Punkt ist erstmal, dass wir die Nährstoffe, die in den Betrieben anfallen, auch möglichst gut nutzen und die Kreislaufsysteme schließen. Insbesondere in Afrika sind oft die Nahrungsmittelkreisläufe noch sehr, sehr unterbrochen. Die Nährstoffe werden nicht wirklich im Betrieb wiederverwertet. Also Frage organische Düngung spielt da nicht so eine große Rolle. Da kann man einiges machen, um das zu verbessern. Und natürlich muss auch die Möglichkeit da sein, Düngemittel vom Weltmarkt zu kaufen. Da sehen wir, dass die Lieferketten einfach funktionieren müssen. Und ein Beispiel ist, dass wir bei den Sanktionen in Bezug auf den russischen Angriffskrieg auch immer darauf geachtet haben, dass bestimmte Produkte nicht unter diese Subventionen fallen, unter diese Sanktionen fallen, damit hier keine Störung der Lieferketten mit Blick auf die Ernährungssicherung auftauchen.
Thank you. Wollten Sie? I give the question to Sergey. You want to and probably...
I would like to respond to what you asked, because it's the trade-off between food security and environmental sustainability is in the core what we try to do in the World Bank. And just a couple of things. I remember that if the world wanted to maintain the Paris Agreement objectives, which is 1.5% maximum increase or not go above, and if you would leave agriculture out of this equation, so say because we produce food and we could not sacrifice food production to achieve environmental objectives. So right now global agriculture accounts for 25% of total GHG emissions. By 2050, if you take agriculture out, agriculture will be responsible for 75% of the emissions globally. So this is not acceptable. Nobody will accept it. So we are at this point, as Cornelia said, that you cannot get excuse that because of food security, we don't need to care about the environmental sustainability. Definitely, there are trade-offs, absolutely. I wanted to bring to your attention, maybe many of you know that the World Bank 2022 produced a study on repurposing agricultural expenditures, policies and expenditures. And this repurposing word has been used a lot in the global fora. And it essentially looks at what happens to the world. There is agricultural support, but which we try to achieve several objectives at the same time with that support, which is not the good approach, because we as economists know one instrument, one objective is the best thing. But in the real political world, you have one instrument, which is the farm support, direct or indirect. You want a lot of objectives. You want a food security, you want to contribute to climate change, and you want a nutritional diets, right? You want to diversify diets. And so there was a lot of modeling work done with IFPRI to look on those trade-offs and how you would best achieve the objectives. Just eliminating the whole agricultural support would not be able to achieve these multiple objectives. The best it works come very close to where EU is moving, of the model of the EU, where you have conditionalities and where you have support for farmers to meet those more stricter requirements. The reality will be in the world that rich countries will be able to do both. We'll have the regulations and expenditures to help farmers to meet those regulations. In developing countries, they will not. They will face higher import protection from the countries, like EU, from the bloc, definitely, but they will not be able necessarily to respond. But I think it is not all gloomy, because the current agricultural productivity is much lower than it could be in many parts of the world. Let's come back to the fertilizer use. And when you look, I recently attended in the OECD the conference, the technical meeting on the total factor productivity and factoring the environment into the total factor productivity. The least, so if you look in the last 15 years, the lowest technical TFP in EU was in the Netherlands. And we say, how could it be? The most advanced farms in the world, the biggest environmental damage was been in Netherlands in the last 15 years. And the result is sort of implications, all of this. Most of the Dutch farms reach production possibility frontier. They're the best technologies, but at the expense of the environment. So it cannot go further. Most world is very beyond production possibility frontier. So in many parts of the world, there is a huge opportunity to achieve both objectives, food security and environmental. But it will be geographical differences, but we can no longer afford not to deal with that trade-off. We are not at the stage where we can ignore it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. Edel.
I can say a few words about your question. So GVCs are, by definition, slow-moving phenomena, due to sunk costs and already established multiple tiers of suppliers, high costs of adjustment, the stickiness of backward and forward linkages, bottlenecks in substitution, all these things, right? Precisely because of that, well, let me just preface what I'm about to say. To say that I'm not advocating this, but from a scholarly point of view, I observe something that I'm about to say about your friendshoring comment and so on. So this is something I observed. I don't think it's the most efficient way of going about it by any stretch, but one has to be scholarly enough to be able to portray what one observes. So precisely because of the stickiness of supply chains and all that, I see that the dramatic pace of decisions and the speed in implementation of the collective response to Russia's onslaught, the display of massive coercive signaling, yes, sanctions, and the relative efficiency of coordinating civilian and military GVCs to aid Ukraine, I think appear to support the hypothesis that these, I don't want to call them democratic clubs, but these entities do enjoy certain advantages, okay? And this rapid and effective response might be surprising precisely because of the unwielding deliberative process that is often theorized in my field as hamstringing democratic decision-making. It's harder for democracies to come to decisions. And yet, precisely because of the nature of GVCs, the rapidity with which decisions had to be taken, it's pretty amazing what has happened over the last year. And it's especially amazing because there are some ailing, polarized, and sometimes corrosive states of democracy, including in my own country, that nonetheless, and this is where the Biden administration should be really praised, were able to perform in quite an efficient way. The expectation that I think there is a democratic disadvantage in organizing or in collective action in this area, I think, is falsified because of a pre-existing GVC infrastructure that enabled that rapid response. I have more to say, but I'm going to stop there. I'm just pleading for sort of being analytical enough to separate it out from what we might or might not want from the GVC world going forward.
Thank you. Just one quick question to you again, because in your first statement you brought a bit the idea that we should take food out of everything, so out of every conflict. Would you have any idea how to manage this? So, if I would interpret this right, so that, for instance, EU countries could still export food to Russia to make it extreme, right? So you say, take it out of conflict, so we still have free trade in food worldwide with everybody, doesn't matter which conflict we are at. So we all agree on taking this out. Would you think this is possible? Who would be the advocate for that?
With all due respect, I'm really not here to tell the EU what it should or should not do.
No,
Because
could be the US as well. I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't think that the US government is forcing that right now.
For instance, the EU has, as an observer from the outside, an array of decisions, for instance, regarding resilience of supply chains based on other than pure economic rationales that I can completely see the logic for. But it really is not up to me to. We have 4 colleagues here that are better endowed to answer that question.
Sure. Yeah, please.
Can I add
Yes.
something on top of that? I just wanted to mention that, of course, the EU has been actively excluding the agricultural sector in Russia and Belarus from its sanction packages. That's what I was. Yeah. That's exactly what and secondly, I would like to draw upon the topic of free markets and open markets. I think we've been discussing this topic only within the realm of grain trading, food trading, and distribution of food. But I think it is also worth considering this topic with regard to the availability of modern agri-technologies. How can they be available to more countries than now? We will be in dire need, I think, of modern agri-technologies also in the future for sustainable food production. And I'm really grateful to Lena for mentioning this topic of digitalized food production in China, for example. I think it's really important that politics steps in to speak out for availability, usability of modern agri-technologies, because it requires some legal frameworks for the use of this, including IP questions, of course. So I think this is something we need to have also in mind when we talk about open markets, that it's not only about the produce, but also of the production means for food security as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Lena,
that's my
please.
keyword. I think if I may pick up here, I completely agree, and I'm kind of, I want to refer to what you said. I mean, for instance, that was also mentioned in Professor Chu's presentation, I think, stocks, so public stocks, strategic stocks. I think this is essentially very often a waste of resources, because there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of, like a lot of these stocks end up on the dumpster, cannot even be fed to animals anymore. So when we talk about trade-off between food security and like environmental sustainability, I think we need to find new solutions. And one of the big problems about global crisis right now is that they are pushing countries into areas of production where they do not have comparative advantages. Yeah? Not every country is suited to produce crop or like wheat. It's just like that. But these comparative advantages do not need to be set in stone. I mean, innovation could change comparative advantages, could extend the possibilities of reaching out there. And we have been talking about giving access to technologies via trade, but we should also be aware of that, just the picture showed, other countries that have been having this kind of pressure for longer, they have been deep into developing these technologies, and it's not like we can profit from them. I would like just to point out, in China there's not a lot of implementation simply because of a lot of restricting factors, but the technology is really quite developed there, and we should be aware of that. So it goes in both ways. Like this crisis could be a catalyst to improve our efficiency altogether, and not just like, in certain crisis countries we assume that they have a need for it.
Thank you. All right, I guess we are at the point where I would like to open the discussion for the audience. So if you want to place a question, just raise a hand. So we already have one. I just start with you. Please introduce yourself quickly and then address if you want to place the question to a specific panelist. Address. Right? It's coming. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Maria Bogonos from Kyiv School of Economics, Center for Food and Land Use Research. I have a question to a colleague who has just been telling us that the response of the democratic countries to the Russian aggression in Ukraine was rapid. Could you please elaborate on the definition of rapid? Because, and what is counted in? What is your baseline? So maybe for Ukraine it was rapid, and for some other countries or situations it was slow. And also, what is the intensity? Is the intensity of the responses counted in? Because basically when the invasion started, the responses of, well, say, concern and judgment were voiced. But Ukrainians started asking, close the Ukraine sky, close the Ukraine sky, close the sky, close the sky. So, and then until we started receiving the air protection systems, quite a time passed. So please elaborate. I think it would give us, it might give us a good overview.
Thank you for your question, and I completely understand your question. Okay. It comes from a very difficult position for the people of Ukraine. So in my country, there is a wide range of opinion, as you can imagine. Largely very supportive of Ukraine, but somewhat divided on the pace of both economic and military support. In economic terms, support has been, I believe, more steadfast. In military terms, it's been staged along with European and other allies. But by the way, my comments before that on the rapid organization of collective action vis-a-vis Russia has to be taken in terms of the GVC angle of things rather than just military support, okay? And I said that despite the difficulty of reorganizing, I actually have another book on the topic of international sanctions, because there's a big debate in my field, as I'm sure you know, on whether sanctions work or don't work. There's a big division of opinion on that. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the difficulty of getting to collective action is notorious, okay? And relative to, you're all economists here, you always ask the question, relative to what? Relative to the difficult of getting to collective action, especially on sanctions, because sanctions are painful for the sender as much as the recipient. Relative to those, historically speaking, the speed of reaction is phenomenal, in my view. And that's what I was trying to say. With respect to the specifics of military aid to the Ukraine, that's a much broader question. I understand the side you're coming from, because you're enduring the brunt force of aggression. But I'm going to stop at that. I think overall the Biden administration has done it right, cautiously, safely, and especially in collaboration with other countries that share the values, okay? And this gives me an opportunity to clarify something that was said somewhere in the last 2 days. I've been so jet-lagged, I can't even remember. The comparison was made between, not comparison, it was said that the Biden administration is just like Trump. Nothing can be more misguided than that statement, and one has to be extremely careful of not being fed misinformation. Okay, there are major differences between the two. There are also there is one unfortunate continuity, like the tariffs. Okay, I don't personally agree with the initial tariffs or the preservation of tariffs on China. But other than that, it's a world of difference, especially in the organization of collective action among like-minded states.
Thank you. Okay, further questions, and we may stick a little bit to the topic of the panel discussion. Okay, so the gentleman in the back.
Ishtia Babajanov from IAMO. The title says Securing Global Value Chains. I don't know what does securing mean, but we had Ms. Solingen and also Mr. Boderson also says that there is open for food trade. It's not under the sanctions. What about like input markets, and what about the technology exchange? Where is our philosophical limit ends? What about research companies or researchers working on this field, and how this could be ruled out?
Thank you very much for the question. Of course, these are very important aspects of international cooperation in very important fields, and I think this is an overall question how we can deal in the future with countries that do not comply to international rules, but are nonetheless very important when it comes to solving questions of global significance, climate change, food security, of course. I think I don't want to get too political about this, but especially when we have a look at the discussion about fertilizer exports from Russia and the availability of fertilizers from Russia in other countries. I think that country cannot expect unhindered trade when it is as a side effect, while it is engaging in a war against one of its neighbor countries. So that's a side effect, which is problematic for countries who are in need of fertilizers, to take this example. But I think this is something Russia should also think about, why there are these side effects. Thank you.
Please.
Working? Oh, yes. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion in the panel. My name is Alexandra Avramenko, Ukrainian Agribusiness Club, and I would have mostly a general question. We know that war is one of the latest disruptions in the global value chain, but before the war there was the COVID, then even before there were the US-China trade wars and Brexit and stuff like this. And we all understand that in the future we will have even more disruptions. And in the end of each global value chain there is a consumer. Value chain is not about only the producers, it's also about the consumers. And in this case, when we talk about the securing of the global value chain, we focus mostly on the producers, the actors of this who are involved. But are there any ideas and also understanding maybe, how can we secure the customers, especially in terms of food, especially in terms of the global food security, which is suffering right now? And we see that each disruption has an extreme effect for the food prices. Any elaboration on this idea, how we can protect and support those who actually need this? Thank you.
Let me take my views on that. I think with it's not only geopolitical tensions, but the climate change. I say we all see climate change becoming real, and with having real impact, and especially on the droughts and floods, and you see huge volatility in the global production, which require trade to smooth that volatility in the global production. And you will see the countries which were dependent on import will become even more dependent on import, in spite of their all efforts to close the productivity gap. They will still a lot and more because they're the most exposed to climate change, which become more serious, right? So there will be more trade, maybe, and it will be, but it will be less predictable. I think for me, when I work in many countries and help them to help the agri-food sector, the countries who are the net exporters, they must be responsible net exporters, right? Because the world depends on them. Many of the net exporters are not responsible net exporters because they introduce export bans, export restrictions, involve different direct and indirect measures, hidden, invisible. And I think, again, the world will be open, so the net importers will be open to trade when the net exporters will be transparent, right? That will become the very important part of the dialogue globally of the secure trade to flow. But the second is the governments of the net exporters need to reduce the cost of the exporters significantly inside of the countries. And there is a huge element, there are big differences in the countries because the net exporters will face more uncertainty on the import market. Some countries will close, some countries will open, climate change. And so it means that for, let's say, for Ukraine, which we know very well, we're both Ukrainians, I think the timely reimbursement of export VAT will solve 70% of problems of reducing transaction costs for exporters. In other countries may be different. There is no magic bullet. There is no significant change needs to be made. Just a very consistent work of reduce the cost of doing business for private companies, and they will adjust. I think they will adjust to that volatility, but the job of the politician not to overreact, but to try to reduce the transaction cost on both import side and export side. the world will adjust to the climate change, from my point of view. Thank you.
Just some small remarks on your issue regarding producers versus consumers. I think we have to keep in mind that the poorest countries with the most hungry people, the hungry people are also the producers. So especially in case of agriculture, very often we have producers and consumers at the same time with the same people. So we have to be very careful about the measures we take, not to hit the same person twice maybe in some cases. Another point on the sanctions. I mean, we have a Russian narrative which say that the sanctions are the reason for high fertilizer prices, for example, or higher prices on the market. I mean, Per Brodersen already said that you have to see the reason for the sanctions before you start this discussion. But the second point is that Russia used all the time since the war started this argument, while at the same time restricting its own exports of fertilizers and putting pressure on importing countries, especially in Africa, to bring them to behave in a way which is in the sense of Russia. So we have really seen discussions at the WTO in the plenary where Russia said, oh, if you behave like that, we stop our fertilizer and food exports to your country. So we need to really observe very carefully what is happening. Thank you.
Further questions? Once again.
Just remain in this topic. Is there any remaining in this topic in the consumer side of it? Maybe my question to Mr. Zoria: is there any kind of bright spot examples to show some kind of measures where some countries could deal under this crisis conditions to protect like the food security in these countries?
Can you repeat the question?
I mean, is there any kind of examples to show which are the kind of good measures, functions in a reality to protect the consumers from such crises?
Again, I would say when I started to work in the World Bank in 2005, there were, because the World Bank worked mainly in developing countries, right? For me, developing countries is the country with low fiscal space, right? It can dream about many things, but the bottom line, it doesn't have money to pay for this. And when I started to work, in Africa region at that time, very few countries had the safety net in a way to be used meaningfully, to use it to respond to the price spikes. The coverage was very low, the leakage was very high, right? It was not effectively used. I think the first global food crisis, 2008, 9, 10, has changed a lot, and many countries, developing countries, started to look carefully on their safety nets. And so they started really in the last 10, 15 years was significant improvement in the coverage of the vulnerable and on the efficiency of the targeting. And there has been, in the recent crisis then, when the COVID strike and the others, when my management reports to the board of the World Bank on what is the response to the food crisis, we look on the agricultural project and the safety net projects. When I was in the global engagement unit 10 years ago, we only reported on agricultural projects. Now it's agricultural and safety net projects, because many countries have mechanisms to shield the vulnerable against the significant price spikes. And definition of significant price spikes is also the very interesting research question. In the armies 10 years ago, I was in the bank side to help in establish that great initiative. There was this three standard deviations from the average. That was supposed to be excessive volatility, was what the excessive, right? And sort of 3 standard deviations from the average was considered to be excessive. Many countries use their own thresholds and the benchmarks, but that's essentially significant volatility. They can use the safety net. Now, the real question is on the safety net. And as I say, that was the good example of responding also in Uzbekistan when reforms, liberalization reforms for the wheat market were only possible because safety net was in place. And increase of prices of bread and flour was compensated through the safety net. It was politically much more acceptable. Now, my biggest challenge with the safety net is that it eats a lot of money. And if the shock is temporary, you can have temporary increase and it's affordable. But what if the shock does not go away? And it's continue, the production cost now will go up. We will never go back to the $100 in Ukraine or whatever production per hectare will be $200 per hectare production cost. So you cannot afford a safety net response, right? And that is the biggest challenge, that even if you have the effective instruments, your fiscal space is very low. That's why you need to look on something on the range of the instruments. You cannot just rely on one. And you need to find a thing which will with significant investments, but you can reduce the annual operational costs. Otherwise, safety net effective to temporary, but not to the permanent where the agricultural markets is entering in the next 10 or 20 years. Thank you.
Lena, please, you want to comment on that?
Maybe just an addition from Chinese experience. So I think their vegetable oil prices were spiking the most during in March 2022. The only question is they had effective means. In their case, it was opening national reserves of vegetable oils. But the question is to whose expense? So you protected your national consumers, but at whose expense? In that case, they had to refill the national reserve on vegetable oils, which further drove global oil prices in this period. So I mean, I think it always has some sort of fallout, either in national balances or internationally.
Thank you. You had a question.
The discussion. I have a comment on the question of the lady, and I appreciate the panel. Let me know if they confirm this point of view. Regarding the producer and consumer side, I think that they are correlated. And if we concentrate on the producer side of the supply chain and we facilitate production and supply of the agricultural products through the supply chain, we have also, we can affect the price of agricultural product, and also we can increase the welfare of consumer, and so consequently, so we can save the demand of consumer for food as well.
Who wants to?
It's a tough question because it doesn't talk about costs. At which costs, right? I think, again, I like to think about my budget, how much money I have, what I can afford. So you can definitely balance producer by producing more, you helping consumers. But I think the challenge was everywhere at which costs, and not everybody. In the EU, I mean, 20 years of reform was essentially did reduce the CAP budget in GDP from 0.4 to 0.31, and still considered to be very high. So I think it's the question is the balance is right, but I think the cost of the intervention become much more higher than was the case before. And because these money are now thought to be used to achieve multiple objectives at the same time. You know, we don't talk about just having bread on the tables. We wanted to have nutritional diets, and we want to deal with the climate change. And so for the same amount of money, you need to deliver 3 times more than you delivered in the past. And that's the challenge which we need to solve with the research, with the transfer of technologies. There was a question on, is there limits to technology transfer? I think, again, in some industries, strategic industries of the microchips, yes, absolutely. Robotics, yes, maybe. But in my work in many countries around the world, I don't see any limits I face right now due to the politics to share experiences from country A to country B on technologies. I mean, that's we often do in our projects because that's how you bring technical change in that country, getting global knowledge into the local context. It will continue. I think agriculture is less exposed to that risk of geopolitical tensions, because I don't think we are we are not microchips. There will be some elements of it, right? But the overall, obviously, 90% of technologies could still freely flow from country to country, despite in which part of the geopolitical border they will be. So I'm more positive on that exchanges continue on the factor markets and on the technology exchange than maybe in some other industries around the world. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Ashur. I'm from University of Humboldt. I wanted to ask and know your opinion about a point. You've spoken about digitalization in agriculture, and there's a lot of money of development cooperation going to digitalizing the trade process, as in facilitating trade to secure food security. There's a lot of, economically, they kind of equate the trade facilitation to a tariff barrier. Nonetheless, there's a lot of people who tend to think now that if we facilitate trade more, we can make less food losses, we can guarantee that the food is used more efficiently. I would like to know your opinion concerning that point, putting money or development cooperation money with regards to trade facilitation, and how efficient is it with regards to securing food security for developing countries?
So thank you very much. So if I understood correctly, you're talking about digitalization in trade, control trade tracing. Okay. So I have to admit that we were focusing on digitalization of production areas. Let's say, I think in the trade perspective, that might certainly help to let's say, so for traceability issues, for instance, are used a lot in terms right already in organic food production, for instance, yeah, for bridging that gap between like buyers here in Europe and producers in I don't know, like Central Asian countries, for instance, where we had that example, no? Due to the distance that you have, like transparency issues, that helps to build value chains, or like, let's say, helps to build trade connections in the first place, because without that technical opportunities, you wouldn't have the transparency needed to actually start trading at all. Yeah, so in this case, yes, as of tracing global trades flows, I think I would need to pass on the question to someone else.
Ms. Burns, please.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to take the question. I mean, we have a lot talked in the WTO about trade facilitation, and I think it worked out quite well. And digitalization is a very good means to facilitate trade. And as far I'm informed that the most of the trade is already now working with digital papers, so that when you ship your goods, then you immediately get in the harbor, where it will be arrive in a few weeks' time, or maybe if you do it by plane in a few hours' time, that they know already what is coming, and they can start with working on the import papers. And I think it helps a lot, especially with perishable goods, so that less food is wasted during this import procedures, because a lot of harbors, it takes hours until the sanitary issues and the papers are done, and we need to quicken that up to avoid food going waste at airports or harbors. Thank you.
All right, Jerry, please.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. This is really let me think a lot about the food security and the interaction of food security and geopolitical tensions. And we all agree, as agricultural economists, free trade is necessary for the food security. But at the same time, we also mentioned that food, fertilizer shouldn't get into this political tensions, all these things. We all agree that. But the countries probably don't have this confidence. You know, we are talking about de-risking, deglobalization, and value-based trade. And this is on the chips or the other products, but how can we avoid that expand to fertilizer and food? If Europe is 50% the food are coming from Russia, what would be happen? On the other side, if Russia is rely on the democracy or European to provide 50% their food, will we apply this food section to try to force to end the war? This is the thing, let me think. And I remember during the COVID time, I'm also, as a consumer, I thought I'm sensible, I'm also stockpile more than I probably needed. So the question is how the world can ensure that food security really become a human right and really be ensured. Do we have the mechanism? Are we just have the visual thinking or just naive on this?
Who wants to go first on that? Big question. Please take a mic.
Do you want to take that?
Look, when we think about the export-import, it's only first step. I mean, for our colleagues left, right? There are 4 dimensions of the food security, right? And so we even didn't start to talk about that. You can have food supply at the global level, but not guaranteed at the national level, and the household level even worse, right? So there are a lot of elements. So guaranteeing food security through global trade, you cannot use global trade as the only pillar of the food security, right? There are many others. Utilization, access, stability. We only talked about availability, but availability is a precondition, right? That's why I think there are a lot of elements. Trade is important and will stay. I don't think it will go away. I think the cost of trade will go up. Non-tariff barriers will go up because we're moving more into the environmental space. So will be definitely more non-tariff barriers in that regard. But we will stay with trade. It's just the cost, just the benefits the world was able to reap from trade in the past will be much smaller. And we have to be prepared for that and look for other drivers of growth, which for each country could be different drivers for growth in addition to trade. Thank you.
There's one question that rumbles a little bit in my mind, and because we have you as an expert here, Edel, is that, I mean, we have various crises we cannot really predict, we cannot really prevent because it's natural catastrophes or something else, but we have these, all the kinds, I mean, I talked to somebody, an economist, and said, okay, when you talk about trade, it was about conflicts all the time. So we had this kind of trade wars. Just a quick question on you. Are we getting any better in solving those trade wars? And is the public getting all the information that is done to resolve those things? Or is that everything behind curtains? And is that necessary? What is your perspective? Is humanity becoming any better in solving those kind of trade conflicts we have? Who are one major source of?
There's a cluster of very interesting questions you're asking. The first thing I want to say is that there is a lot of transparency. Where I live, there is a lot of transparency in what's happening, okay? There is so much transparency that I want to come back to the question of our colleague here from Kiev. On the first point I made, there's so much transparency that for the first time, the Director of National Intelligence, this is the top agency presiding over 16 intelligence agencies in the United States, came out before the war, to warn the world that this was coming. That's transparency. It's very unfortunately that we weren't able to, that the world wasn't persuaded to deter everything that came afterwards. Okay, so I wanted to link those two. Had the warnings be heeded, maybe we wouldn't be here discussing this topic, but they were not. And this is a historical kind of, it's a pattern of, again, failing to heed the signs. Now, as to where we go next, no, I don't think we're at a point where we can be optimistic about where things are going. But there's a short term, the middle term, and the long term, right? And I once worked on a paper. It was published by the Oxford Encyclopedia of Empirical International Relations, I think, with a co-author at the University of California, San Diego, Peter Gurevich. And we looked at patterns of inward and outward-oriented cycles in over the last since the repeal of the corn laws, right, worldwide, and we looked at it cyclically, and on the basis of certain things we argued in that paper, I will want to believe that we will get out of this cycle. We're not there yet, but it will take a lot of effort to strengthen to strengthen the way we approach things, including transparency, but also defeating misinformation and strengthening all the mechanisms that are that lead to more cooperation, rather than mechanisms that are divisive and designed to drive cleavages across countries. But we're not there yet, is my view. I hope I hope we have it, and we're not there today. But I think eventually we will get back to that. And international institutions, I think, have to be once again at the center. WTO and all the rest. I disagree with, obviously, with the policies of the Trump administration, WTO and so on, but that's for another.
Sure, thank you. Further questions? We got still room for one or two, so anything you'd like to ask our experts on the panel? Please.
Was me, right? So he mentioned that, of course, the free trade will be a kind of under the risk, or anyway, we're going to face the non-tariff barriers because of the environmental concerns and greening. So imposing these kind of barriers, does it threaten free trade? Is then the trade really free? What is your opinion? What do you think about it?
Yeah, that's the question what we discussed, trade-off between food security and environmental sustainability. I just say that unfortunately for agriculture, we are at the period where neither politically nor socially is possible to ignore the environmental side. It means that I would say when we look on the Green Deal, we in the World Bank, we are very carefully looking on the new cap and how it works out, because there are a lot of right elements which we try to promote in other countries. And so we actually look on implementation successes to replicate it all over the world. The difference is that you combine regulations and expenses to help farmers to comply with that regulation with input protection. So you have a couple of the support instruments. Well, many countries don't have that fiscal space, right? And you cannot just impose very strict regulations and they will not comply. And so I would say, so the greening will influence the access to markets, definitely. And many countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil already complaining on the oil, on the palm oil and on the others. This is linked to the deforestation. But we reach the point where the planetary boundaries are exceeded. So unfortunately, we like it or not, it will be the new reality of the global trade. And that's why the countries have to be prepared. And the countries which will complain will lose. The countries which will start to prepare, adjust, will win in this global game. So we are in the new normal of the geopolitics and the climate change, which require a lot of changes on the many sides. Thank you.
So we are about to end this panel discussion. I would like to do this by giving every panelist a chance for a last sentence, for a last statement, and we will be doing this in the order we started with. So I give the word to Frau Berns.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to make it short because I know you are getting hungry and tired. There was a question about food security and how it will end up. I think we all have to have in mind that the right to food is a right we all have to strive to reach. And we will work on that. We will work on that nationally, but also with our international partners. And it will take time. We don't have much time left until to the 2030. So we have to work quicker and harder, and we all will do that at best that we can. Thank you.
I think we've seen more than one eye-opener in the last few years for intensified dialogue. So my plea would be that while the clock is indeed ticking, that we make use of all the available things we have at our hands to make food production more sustainable, including modern technologies and making use of what we have at our hands. Thank you.
I don't have much to add other than endorsing what all the panelists here have said. Again, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to learn so much about food security from all of you.
We are in the Research Institute, and I think you are living in the very exciting time, because the shocks is the opportunity for researchers to do something new. Remember those boring Clinton times where everything was predictable, and Angela Merkel time, everything was transparent, predictable, and we knew what will happen in 10 years. You could not do much research on you. Now you live in the era of shocks. It's exciting time for you to make a difference. So I'll look forward, encourage you to think about it, to be innovative, outside of the box. And a lot of people will listen to you, because this require a solution of these global problems we talk about require a lot of work, including on the research side. Thank you. Yes, you go back.
As I said, I love the comments on the panelist side, and I actually just published an article exactly about that, the opportunities. It's a very tough time for all of us, all of our disciplines, but it does offer an opportunity to understand crisis better, how we operate, what we should do and what we shouldn't do. So I really, really commend your comments.
Not much to be said. I think we all agree that we could do with a bit more peace and calm now. But given the situation, I think I completely agree. Let's take this as an opportunity, also in research, to think about new solutions and treat this as a catalyst and as an incentive.
Okay. And last but not least, let's thank all our panelists together for this really inspiring information we got and the good talk. And thanks for the audience, for the questions, for your patience. And I hand over now to the organizers who want to say some closing words.